Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blabbit. You have come across the weekly podcast where we talk to experts and they share their insights and very often some of their secrets about what it is they do best and why people love them. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Blabbit is sponsored by Open Doors, your premier corporate communication platform for employee engagement. My name is Paul Geiger. I am a public speaking coach and a presentation expert out of New York City, and I help organizations and individuals be able to deliver their messages with a very high level of engagement, trust, and ultimately persuasion. Hello, Mr. Glenn Ingram. It's great to see you
Hello.
again, sir.
Hello, Paul. Great to see you. Hi, everyone. My name is Glenn Ingram. I've been working in training, coaching, and helping salespeople become better listeners so they can become better influencers and help people make buying decisions. Good morning, JT. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. This is a great honor to be here.
Fantastic.
Tell us about yourself briefly, please.
Certainly. I am founder, speechwriter, and storytelling consultant at The Content Interpreter. That's my consultancy. And my philosophy is that your greatness shouldn't be a secret to your audience. So I work with thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and C-suite members, and a few others around the edges to work on their speeches, their presentations, and other thought leadership content to make sure that they're sharing that greatness.
Okay, so JT, I was thinking about this prior to the show, and I would love to get your take on which of these two is the bigger struggle for most individuals. Is it number one, not being able to give yourself permission to tell a story, or is it number two, just not knowing the right way to tell a story?
That's an interesting question. I think what is most fascinating to me, and perhaps you two can relate to this, is that most of the people that I've worked with, despite their brilliance, despite their scope of accomplishment, struggle with the former. That they don't feel like there is content that gives context. So personal storytelling, how they're personally connected to their expertise, they don't feel for whatever reason that that's relevant. They say, okay, I've reached a certain point and people want to hear the nuts and bolts of my expertise, which they do. But I always encourage my clients by telling them that it's that personal connection that often gives context and greater meaning in your presentation. So while it feels fairly equal, I would have to say that the first one really is the bigger struggle, because they feel like they're breaking some kind of rule that, I don't know, I've never seen it written down. I don't know if you guys have, but they feel like it is a rule that must not be broken.
Well, is it an ego thing? I mean, do you think for most of us, and I know, we're pulling the cover off all of us, because there's a sense of embarrassment if your story, let's say, crashes and burns.
That's true. I don't think, maybe I've just been lucky, but with my clients, I don't think it's an ego thing. I mean, I think there's fear, right? And then there's ego. I think fear certainly drives a lot of it, but ego, I don't know. I almost feel like it would be more egotistical to lean the other way and say, oh, well, everyone's going to want to hear every detail of my life and how I got to be where I'm going to be, rather than the nuts and bolts, the actual content, the research that they've done, whatever it might be. So I think it's probably better described as fear as opposed to ego. I don't know. What has been your experience?
Well, I mean, I always put embarrassment, fear of looking bad. It's a part of ego. It's not always the big, brusque, brash, egotist, look at me, outgoing extrovert kind of a thing. So that's my expanse of ego. Just my understanding of it covers a lot of ground, and most fear. There's a lot of that fear of embarrassment. Don't you agree, Glenn? What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, humans are the most self-deprecating animal on the planet. We're always going to fear the what if, what's going to happen to this? What if I do something wrong? I mean, I think it's just good when you kind of need that little 70s show and just get slapped on the back of the head and walk up and talk.
Just get up there.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You have broadened my expanse of understanding ego too, because I always thought of it as that brashness. So maybe it is ego. I don't know, but it was always presented to me as, oh, they won't be interested in that, or I don't want to reveal that because I don't see how it's relevant, or I would rather use a version of an anecdote that is not as exposing,
Right.
versus the one that you're recommending. And of course, the struggle there is always that the one that I'm recommending is, I think so, much more interesting to the audience. And the benefit, I think, of doing this is that I am able to approach it genuinely from the layman's perspective. I've worked with orthodontists, for example, and I'm certainly, you do not want me to work on your teeth or your mouth in any way. I'm not qualified at all to do that. But it allows me this perspective to say, well, you know what, as someone that is not at all skilled in what it is that you do, you need to create points of accessibility for your audience. And this is how you would do it.
Well, and isn't that the goal with an orthodontist, is to set things straight?
Good one. I like that. It took me about a microsecond to get that. So there's a little delay, but I'm proud of myself. I caught on. Good one.
We'll blame that on the Zoom technology. The delay, not the pun.
And don't you find that when someone's doing a presentation or they're speaking in front of a group, we kind of default back to those speech courses, those structure that you have where you have to talk about all these things and not really have the relatability, not to have the storytelling. Because I mean, in sales, an old adage is numbers and statistics tell, stories sell. So if you can't make it relatable to the people, if you can't put it in a manner that's going to make them excited and basically be in the shoes of this could happen to me, does a presentation really have any value if you're not relating to the people you're talking to?
Oh, I don't think so. You hit it right on the nail there. So nail right on the head, rather. There's another expression. I think that it is important, essential even, to create those moments of accessibility and relatability. And I think that, at least in my experience working with my own clients over the years, once they see the product, which is usually the written speech or the written content, with and without, that's when the eyes get wide and it's like, oh, wow, this is actually so much better. And because they understand now the connection, sometimes they don't understand how their own personal experience relates to content, which at times gets highly technical. Once they understand it, they're like, oh, well, I can't imagine this piece of work being without that now. So that's also, it's a fun moment. It's a shifting. What I always say is that part of my job is to, for some clients anyway, is to shift the mindset from obligation to opportunity. Because a lot of clients, they'll sometimes approach me and they'll be like, well, I was asked by a colleague of mine to speak at this thing and I don't know how to do this. And it's like this whole thing like, well, let's get through it. And then by the end, it's like, oh, this actually works. And I've had clients go on to take that as a banked speech for future conferences that they can adjust and tailor to that specific audience that they like it so much. So that's always fun to see.
Well, here's an example of, yes, Glenn, I do pay attention to all of our guests. I remember that we had I believe it was the end of 2020, one of our very early episodes, we had Josh Fletcher on, and he made a comment that still sticks with me to this day. And he was talking about speaking at conferences. And he said he does reveal a story that is close to him or very vulnerable. He does expose that vulnerability because his thinking is his audience is listening and saying, well, if that guy is willing to say that, whatever else he's going to say, it's going to be the truth. And I trust him. So there's, again, another argument for being bold right in the beginning. And I understand there's a balance between TMI and being able to relate the right level of vulnerability through story. But we all know that stories are what we latch onto. They are the things that we
Absolutely.
remember.
I'd love to get your take on this. What do you think about? Well, I always, you said a balance. So let me put it to you like this. I've always said that you don't want to have a
Did you just make JT? Did you make JT freeze, Glenn? Are you
Yes.
just wielding your power again?
Well, I forgot to tell him he wasn't allowed to ask questions, so I froze him.
Sorry, JT.
You froze for a minute.
For a second there, but you're
That's
back
okay.
in perfect Blabbit style.
Okay. All right. Well, I wasn't allowed to ask question. There's a demerit.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Ask again.
Well, I find this idea of balancing between TMI and a relatable story to be interesting. And so my guiding philosophy on that is like, well, obviously I can't make a client do what they want to do, especially do what they don't want to do, rather, because in my position, it's usually presenting a final written product and they'll either take it and use it of not using any part of it. But in public speaking coaching, Paul and perhaps Glenn too, how do you maintain that balance to draw the best out of people from a formative sense? Because that's where I'm less involved, and I know that you two are much more involved.
Well,
how do you encourage them to get to that place?
Can I take this one first, Glenn? Well, one of the things that I do with my clients in order to sort of ease them into the pool of doing that so that they don't have a knee-jerk reaction about, oops, I just, delivered a little too much information, is I start with them telling me their favorite mentor story where they actually get to talk about somebody else. And I know I've talked about this before with you, Glenn, on Blabbit. And what's great about the mentor story is, number one, you get to talk about someone else. You're just talking about what you saw, what you experienced, what your relationship was like. And then I tell them after they've told me the mentor story, I said, well, what the real Jedi mind trick is with that is it goes back to the old quote by Wayne Dyer. If you spot it, you got it. So in other words, everything that you say about that person, you're actually talking about yourself. And that's the way I begin to draw people out of that feeling, because now they recognize, well, oh, you mean the fact that that person was so generous means that I am a generous person too? Oh, okay. So I'm not revealing my most embarrassing moment. What I'm revealing is the qualities that I actually admire. Okay, well, that's the beginning of the process. That would be one of the important stories that I would use in that process of getting people to understand where that balance lies for them. And it's a little bit different. And then we move on to subsequent other stories. And perhaps most of the time, all of those stories will resonate once you begin to open up and dive into that reservoir of perspective and observation.
I think it's important just to get away from.
You just made me realize.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's
important. No, I was just going to say to Paul that you made me realize that I actually. No, I'm not going to talk again. Screwing this up.
It's you.
We've got ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight delay going on here, just in case Glenn and JT happen to use profanity here in Blabbit. So we're doing the 7-second buffer that is a standard in broadcasting. All right, so gentlemen, you've been warned.
I'm going to say this, that Paul, your anecdote just made me realize that I had a moment with a past client of mine that was very similar to that. She was talking about a mentor, but it was completely accidental that she used that. It wasn't a prompt for me. And so I was just commenting, I find that very fascinating that that's something that you use as a standard practice, because if I'm recalling correctly, it got that the fact that she talked about her mentor actually got us through kind of a rough patch in terms of developing content and stories. But it was entirely her doing. So all credit to her. So fascinating stuff. And now, Glenn, I'm going to close my mouth and I'm going to throw it to you, as is also the standard in live television.
Well, I always find it interesting that people more often than not are comfortable having a conversation more than being up there with all eyes upon them. So it's kind of like building up that muscle a little bit and having a conversation, and then building into that presentation, into that speech, a conversation, having sometimes when you're getting interaction, so it doesn't trigger that dopamine in your brain to just freak out. Everyone's looking at me. What am I going to do next? Because I'm talking to Paul, I'm getting a reaction from Paul. So it's kind of that blending a speech, presentation, and a conversation for people that have that mental roadblock that doesn't say, hey, I get to talk in front of people. It's like, oh crap, I have to talk in front of people.
So
Right.
let's just take a look for 1 second in terms of the people who may be on the verge of giving a presentation or do that on a regular basis. The idea of having a conversation and asking the questions. Now, in a conversation, you do ask a question of a specific person and they do respond back. But when you're giving a presentation, you can also take advantage of rhetorical questions, correct? But you've got to be able to emotionally navigate the silence, because no one is necessarily given permission to answer your question in a conversational way. So there is a little bit of that goes in. Now, I understand, Glenn, we've talked about this too, asking questions where you literally are prompting a response. You literally want to see a show of hands. You want to hear a collective yes. You want to hear a shout out. You want to hear whatever it is. And some situations will allow for that and some won't. So what do you guys think about that idea of inserting rhetorical questions as a device when you are telling a story? And obviously the simplest one to utilize is, have you ever noticed, which is a classic comedy opening, which
Yeah, I was going to
most
say, is that more
comedians know.
stand-up?
That's more of a stand-up, but giving a presentation, you're standing up. But still, have you
Very
ever
true.
noticed, doesn't have to be the opening line to a joke or to a funny observation. It could literally be the opening line to something very serious or something that people could determine to be serious or important. What has been, you guys, what has been your experience with that?
I haven't actually used that. I haven't employed that device much, but perhaps I should do that more. I have seen and heard a very effective TED Talks start that way, though. So there's so much validity to what you're saying. I tend to encourage clients to perhaps use a different way of getting to that same result, get the same result that the rhetorical question would provide, and really just start in what they would consider a literary term, like in media res, right? In medias res. So it's just like, okay, let's start and let's open with something that is more of a declarative statement, but would entice the audience to want to keep listening. So I think that those two are kind of the same, but I think I'm going to give some consideration now to the rhetorical question. That's an interesting device.
Well, you're asking for a response. You are,
Right.
or at least you are creating a framing and then literally inviting everyone to take an even closer look. So that's the way I see it. And usually it's not something that comes out of left field, though it can. What were you going to say, Glenn?
I think some of those depend on your audience. So, are you going to ask a little bit more of a pointed one versus, rhetorical and stuff like that? So it's just kind of maybe testing the water and seeing which kind of reaction you get from either one, and then kind of letting that dictate the path. But yeah, I think anytime you can get them thinking, get them involved, even if they're only involved in their head doing mental prep reps or whatever, like you would say on a sports team, I think, yes, the more involved you can get them, the more engaged they're going to be, and the better the presentation or the speech is going to be for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Now, JT, you are a content interpreter. You're also a speech writer. So what happens when you've put some of that work together for a client? I know you work in very close, work very closely together with them. But have you ever run into an experience where somebody says to you, "Oh, I would never say that," or is it completely their words? Yep.
Absolutely. Well, that is part of the challenge for me, and why I put so much work up front into reading their books and watching their videos, whatever else they have to give me, because I'm not only listening or watching or reading to get to know them and try to catch up in terms of their expertise and get a good foundation, but I'm also listening to how they turn a phrase and trying to pick out those patterns. But it is not a game that you can win right off the bat, in my experience. It's something I get a little better at each time. And as I'm editing and editing and editing, I find places to put like, oh, well, this is how he would actually speak, or this is how she says this thing. I'm just using the wrong phrase for the same sentiment, and wrong meaning that it's not the way that she would say that. So that is, for me, the most challenging aspect, because there are already so many things that you're considering as you're writing. It's like, who's the audience, and what's the length, and what should the rhythm be? And there's this very musical quality to the whole thing. And then I find that it's probably better to layer that in towards the end. I won't say absolute last, but towards the end, and as a final check through, one of the things that I'm checking for is like, does this sound like this other speech or this other video that they may have shot that sound reasonably close to, so that the audience isn't going to be like, they didn't write that? Because there's nothing. Well, there are some things that are worse, truthfully, but that is one of the big no-nos in my mind.
Okay.
So I have a question here, because this kind of came up on Josh Beecraft's podcast yesterday, Paul, and it was all about people understanding their value. Constantly we have people that suffer from imposter syndrome. I'm not going to know as much or enough to speak to people in the room, because they don't understand and appreciate the value that they bring. So how much is it kind of asking questions, talking to the people you're trying to help promote, to get the information out there, to be able to then come back to them and say, you told me that you know this, and this. It sounds to me like you are an expert in your field, to build that confidence up so that we can maybe push that imposter syndrome aside.
Well, I think imposter syndrome, I think, is fascinating. I suffer from it myself. I did a podcast episode a few years back actually talking about that. And I listened back, or I look back on that experience. I don't think that I'm completely over some of the things that I described in that episode. So it's something that affects a lot of people, certainly most of us. And the only thing that gives me comfort is what I've heard anyway. I don't know if this is true in my case, but the better that you are, the more likely you are to feel imposter syndrome. So I take comfort in that little sliver of knowledge. I think that to answer your question more directly, I don't know that many of my clients have out and out imposter syndrome. I think it's more about that fear factor, or that ego factor that we were talking about earlier, than imposter syndrome. I do find that listening effectively, which is a skill set that I've had to develop and that I'm still working on, and working on asking more effective questions, and having read books about being an effective interviewer from award-winning journalists have allowed me to ask those questions that will get more out of my client and thus make them more comfortable. Because like I said earlier, there's this connection factor, and sometimes they're not connected to, or they don't realize the connection to it. And so if you ask a question that is born from being well prepared, and you yourself are well informed, and they say something that's a little nugget that confirms in their own mind that, hey, I actually am an expert, or it is safe to go on these waters, then they can't really dispute that. You can't unring that bell. So that's what I've witnessed with some of my clients. And that's kind of how I would describe it, perhaps, versus just a straight textbook definition of imposter syndrome. It's fascinating. Have you had any experience with that?
Well, a lot of experience with imposter syndrome. And by the way, JT, we are all on this journey. To a certain extent, everybody feels this, but I have come to redefining that not as imposter syndrome, and this seems to resonate with a lot of my clients. I refer to it as expert syndrome. Because when you are in front of everyone and suddenly the room gets quiet and all the eyes are on you, you feel an enormous obligation to make it worth those people's attention. And that can screw you up, because a lot of people, yes, they are experts. Okay, that's a given. You're the expert. But the need to show that you're an expert is probably the stronger emotion that you're feeling. Not that you're a loser and you haven't, because the word imposter sometimes throws people off. So I go, no, you're suffering from expert syndrome, where you feel the need to do too much. You feel like even if you do too much, it's still not enough. So I like to redefine it that way. And it seems to be resonating with people, because then it includes the fact that they really are an expert, but they're not being clear about what they're trying to get across, and they feel a need to constantly catch up, and therefore they're not sufficient. So in a sense, it is defining the imposter syndrome, just in a more inclusive way.
So I have a question for both of you with regards to that, because again, words have meanings and we're our own worst enemies. So how important is it for some people to change it, that you're not the expert giving you a presentation, you're the specialist? Because the specialist specializes in a thing, but they don't have to be the expert. So just by changing that word in their brain, how much do you think that would help them kind of get out of their own way and not have to worry about being perfect, because I'm no longer the expert, I'm just a specialist?
Well, and a specialist, as long as it doesn't mean throw every detail on the, at the wall and see what sticks, then I'm all for it.
I would agree with that. And Paul, I love what you said about, hey, you're an expert. That's a given. Now, I've often told my clients, my very first client, actually, I said, expertise is basic. And what I meant by that was that's really just that's the reason that you're there. You wouldn't be there if you weren't some kind of an expert or a specialist, or however you want to talk about it. It's what are you going to bring to it? How are you going to use the power of storytelling to package that expertise? That is what I found is the biggest challenge of all. And I've worked with clients that, to their enormous credit, particularly one college professor client I worked with a few years ago, who literally co-wrote the textbook on her area of expertise. She said, I can't go into this symposium of ER staff and physicians and all these people and treat it like one of my lectures. I mean, that was obvious to her that she couldn't do that. And I think it would be obvious to most people, but she knew that it's like, well, I can't even modify what I would say in a lecture hall, even just a little bit, and have that be passable. So it's this really interesting phenomenon, I think, of saying, okay, yes, I am an expert. Suffice it to say, that's basic. That's a given. Now, how do we in some moments deconstruct that a little bit and construct a new way of presenting that in a way that's engaging to audiences. So that I think it's right at the heart of what we all do, really.
Right. Now, that brings up an interesting point, because I have heard this phrase even a couple of times during this episode, and that is know your audience. Let's not gloss over that know your audience, because let's sort of deconstruct that, open it up and say, there are things you can know about your audience, and there are some things that you can't know. So let's talk about those two things in terms of the due diligence that you do need to utilize in order to figure out the things that you do know, the things you can know about your audience, and then also discuss some of the things that you're just simply going to find out as you go along.
Interesting. That's a weighty question. That's the heavy. I just felt a thud on the desk. That's the heaviest thing we've talked about today. Wow.
Because you just started to touch on it, JT, because you're saying this is what I would do in a lecture as an expert, but I can't sound like I'm pandering to my coworkers, to my peers, if I discuss this with them. Therefore, my audience has changed. So a little experience with that. And I know, Glenn, you've had this experience too, all the time when you speak on the podcasts, when you have to begin to visualize or at least ascertain who your audience really is.
I think it's interesting because this is the point where this goes from being more art than science. It is truly indeed both, in my opinion, but you can know a lot about your audience, and you should, as you mentioned, to do that due diligence, but there is some artistic license that you can take there to show them, quote, the real you, which is what creates that relatability that we were talking about. In the case of this college professor that I referenced, she was talking to ER staff and physicians. And I can't remember who decided that this would be a good idea, but her favorite show just happened to be Grey's Anatomy, which she was uncomfortable revealing anyway, because she's this serious academic and watching this soapy drama. But I said, no, I think that works in context. And I think we actually used it in as partly as a joke to just kind of milk that premise of, hey, this renowned serious academic loves this show and it's her favorite television show, but also to demonstrate some of the conflicts that come up within a team. And then that can apply to any professional team. So it was taking a bit of a leap of faith. She knew, obviously, that this audience was extremely educated. You'd have to be, right, to work in an ER, obviously. And the inclusion of that little tidbit was maybe stepping just outside of the line. You don't really know how the audience will react to that. I think you could probably safely assume that would be taken with the humorous intent in which it was delivered. But I think that that kind of an audience and that kind of a setting would also be waiting for you to swing back around and relate it to something that's actually germane to your content. So that little dance I find fascinating because it does demonstrate, here's what I know about my audience, physicians, ER staff, and here's something that I can't possibly know is how they will relate to this particular tidbit, but I'm going to go out there and take a swing at it. And as I recall, it worked very well for her. But it's a risk. It's these things are not 100% foolproof. And so that's what I kind of find interesting, is finding those little things and seeing what we can do with them.
Well, aren't you able to be proactive about that sort of thing if you're going to sort of stick your neck out, so to speak, a little bit? Because I could imagine taking the chance and beginning the reveal about being a fan of the show Grey's Anatomy, and then simply gauging the crowd by going, "Ooh, did I hear some groans?"
Yeah.
And
It's true.
that alone,
And
that alone would lighten up the crowd to the point where you wouldn't even have to tell, an amazing story. All you'd have to do is just that little bit of reveal. And we all know from having spoken in front of audiences, once you get people to laugh a little bit along with you, or at times even at you, that goes a long way to just breaking that ice. And immediately the audience feels like, in a small way, they know you, that they can relate
yeah.
to you. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to say a couple things I feel I should clarify. First, Grey's Anatomy is a fine program. I'm not a regular viewer, but obviously it's been on the air, I think almost 20 years now. So they're obviously doing something right. They know their audience. So I just want to clarify that. I think that this discussion is awesome. This debate about like how much about it should we include, et cetera, was coming from her perspective. I think that relates back to what we were saying is like, well, how much over the line, whether that's a real line or not, from that client's perspective, should I step? And she felt like revealing that was a monumental shift for her in terms of her reputation. And as I recall, there were other references. I don't remember specifically what they are, so don't ask, but there were other references that she did not want included that were kind of along that same line. But because we were speaking to ER physicians and staff, the fact that it was Grey's Anatomy, it was just kind of like, oh, we can't resist using that. We're going to allow ourselves that one. And part of it for me, what the learning experience for me is that almost always, I'd say actually always, the clients know their audience better than I do. And so they, as much as I'm guiding them, they have to guide me too. And she made it pretty clear that it's like, well, this is the one that I'm going to be allowed to have. We had another story that showcased her origins and how she got into the social sciences in general, which is I think another area that she probably would not have gone into previously, or at least not in that way. And so it was like, oh, we already have this. And if the Grey's Anatomy reference hadn't been this sort of shiny little new toy to put in, I don't know if that would have made it in either. So it's a really interesting dynamic and kind of a line that you sort of walk on either side. Sometimes it's a tightrope. It's very interesting.
Well, we've gone full circle, because my first question was giving yourself permission to tell a story. And there you go. There's
and I planned it exactly that way. I just want you to know that I am playing three-dimensional chess here, and I could just see
actually,
it.
that was supposed to happen at 41 minutes after the hour, JT. So you're a little bit of an overachiever, but
a little bit early. Okay, all right. You got me. See, I am an imposter. And we bring it full circle again.
So when you look at this relatability, it comes up a lot on our show, Paul, where we talk about authenticity and kind of who you are in your life, in your career, in your experience. And I say this because I've been fortunate to be able to have some lunches around some very great people throughout my life. And two people that really come to mind with different ways of being relatable based on struggles, experience, successes, was having lunch and listening to Rudy Rudiger, and having lunch and listening to Bill Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under Reagan and the drug czar under Bush. They both made themselves relatable, but in completely different deliveries. Rudy was a little bit more harsh and Bill was a little bit more poised, but they still were able to make themselves relatable. And I think that shows you that no matter where you are or who you're talking to, it's a way to be able to do it. It's just maybe on different scales.
So was that based on personality, Glenn? When you say harsh, was he just being very, very blunt?
Rudy's just funnier than hell.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Making fun of himself or making fun of everyone in the room?
Very self-deprecating.
Yep. Okay.
Interesting.
He fit the story from the movie in real life, I guess. And
Hmm.
Bill was just polished, and his way of relating was to having lunch with Bush Jr. when they were and talking about picking up a VP last week. It was 2 weeks before they announced who the VP was going to be. So I mean, just different ways to be able to talk to you and put you in a room with something. Just two different rooms.
Interesting. Now, I have a follow-up question for that. Do you think that you said that Rudy was very true to what you saw in the film, which we all remember is a great film. Do you think that the way that these two gentlemen presented was partially in response to the audience's expectations? Or is it more of just, hey, this is who I am. This is how I'm going to present because I don't really know any other way, and I'm not interested in trying to craft a completely contrived persona just for the stage. I recognize it can be both, but do you think that there was some kind of reaction there, just wanting to meet audiences' expectations of who they know these men to be?
Yeah, my perception on both of them is they were just authentic to themselves. And they were intelligent enough to know how to relate to different people based on their experiences, their techniques and trials, their lives and things like that. But it was just with Rudy, you were rolling. With Bill, you were just smiling, thinking, "I want to learn more. I want to listen more. He drew you in, but at a level up here, where with Rudy, we were on the floor rolling and laughing."
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
That's it reminds me of a dilemma I've had with a few clients that sometimes they want to emulate, not specifically, not where it gets to the art of being an impressionist or even mimicry, but they want to emulate specific public speakers that they admire.
Right.
And they'll ask me like, oh, well, who should I watch or who should I observe? And my instinct is always to tell them like, well, you should watch, but really only with the perspective of like, well, what can I learn? How can I incorporate certain choices rather than the specific action themselves? So for example, I was working with a couple of Wall Street clients a while back, and I used Barack Obama as an example. I can't remember what it was, but there's a specific way that he turns a phrase. And I remember myself having to kind of walk that back a little bit because I don't want them to go up there and use that and take that too literally as like, oh, well, this is what you should do, because then it's like, well, you're just trying to impersonate or borrowing too heavily from someone that you admire, and the admiration is genuine and the intent is genuine, but it's nonetheless appears that way to an audience. So I don't know what your take is on that, but I always try to really make sure that they're incorporating and internalizing certain things that they like about other public speakers, and making that boundary very clear.
Well, I will make a recommendation to watch a particular speech, but only to watch for maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most things that they are doing, not the things that they are necessarily saying, because cadence is your own unique way of delivering words. But for instance, if it is a matter of stagecraft, moving around a stage, I would recommend Brene Brown's vulnerability speech. And
Excellent.
if it's a matter of, just whatever it might be that we are working on at that point, because I want it to be active. I don't want it to be cerebral. I want them to, of course, recognize and become aware of what that person is doing, and then begin to integrate a little bit of that in without consideration to the words. Not that we're going to leave the words out, but I think that's the better, getting people used to the muscle memory that will literally, as you know, will change the way they deliver the words. You can easily do that with coordinated gestures, with breathing. You can change cadence, but you have to be able to do those physical things. You can't just decide to do it. It will fall flat.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating.
How about you,
That's a
Glenn?
good one. That Brene Brown talk.
Well,
Yeah, ask her.
I'm going to answer this in a question. It's kind of interesting if you're looking at some of our best, I'm going to say, motivational speakers talking about success, that most of their stories about failure, because how they failed and then failed and then failed before they reached success. JT may be a little bit young for this. I don't know if you remember, Paul, those success seminars that were going around the country in like 99, 2000, 2001, where you would have Lou Holtz, Zig Ziglar, and all these guys. And the common denominator from every successful person on the stage was how they failed until they hit it and went off in another trajectory. So do you have to have a level of success to focus on the failures to show that you can come through it? How would you go about giving a presentation like that to, again, show relatability, show vulnerability, and how much do you talk about success or failures versus talking about success if you're giving a presentation like that?
Well, that is an easy one, right,
Hmm.
JT? I mean, literally, Glenn, you've just laid out the blueprint, probably one of the easiest vulnerability blueprints, which is to admit some of your mistakes, because then you're simply saying to the audience, I've been where you may be or where you've been. See, I've been there too.
Mhm.
And that's an easy entree into what comes next is worth listening to. Right, JT?
Absolutely. And so easy, in fact, that outside of giving speeches and presentations, this idea of admitting vulnerabilities has really become in vogue. I've seen it on social media. There was, I don't want to name it specifically, but if you know, as the kids say, right, there was a story this week where that came up, that very idea. And it had some very mixed reactions in terms of the comments on social media. Some folks thought it was like, oh, so authentic and vulnerable and brave. And other people were like, wow, please, cry me a river. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I don't want to pile on this person, but and I certainly don't want to say where I come down on that. I think it's a delicate balance. But I agree. It's become so easy that I think some people overuse it, overextend it. And we saw that the way that can backfire with some audiences this week.
Well, you know what? This thought just came to me because my good friend Glenn Ingram has said many times with
Boy,
disdain.
that's you.
Yeah,
That's this guy.
that's this Glenn right here. What do you expect from social media, or words to that effect? Meaning it, but the way it ties into what we're talking about here is very often you don't know your audience. If you're going to throw that out there to the right audience, it will be embraced. If you're going to throw it, excuse me, out to the social media wind, you got to expect to be blown around a bit. So that comes down to not really knowing your audience. If you did, you would restrict it to the people you think would receive it well. Otherwise, you stand in a place of diminished returns and pretty much expected criticism.
So
That's
I can come back
true.
with my social media thing 2.022. So 2022 social distancing is staying away from social media.
We don't know how to anymore, Glenn.
Well, I find that interesting because, and it gets me to ask the question, and perhaps it's a bit out there, but what if the in-person audiences were social media? I mean, what if you could interact with an in-person audience in the way that social media audiences feel that they have license to interact with you, whether it's deserved or not? I mean, I wonder if the whole approach, the whole process to either medium would be different if you knew that, hey, there was this open line of communication. In person, of course, audiences can express their approval or disapproval with a clap or a groan, but that's really about it. I think that this example that I'm talking about, this unnamed example, kind of brings up an interesting point and probably demonstrates why there is such a fear or ego, because you don't really know when it might go south, and you could have the very best of intentions and it falls apart anyway.
Right. But when you get up in front of people, it has already been established what the dynamic is, that you are the person who is expected to drive the bus. Therefore, come hell or high water, you can still drive the bus, but you've got to navigate the positive or the negative. So again, going back to the comment we made about bringing up Grey's Anatomy and just saying, yeah, just hearing that would make you'd have to acknowledge it, or as I said, be preemptive and say, did I hear some groans out there, and be able to navigate that. But still, you're the one in the audience dynamic, in the live presentation or in a Zoom presentation. You're the one driving the bus. That dynamic has already been established. So yes, it's a big obligation, but you still possess it.
Absolutely. I just heard my 3-year-old son yell. And so now I'm wondering, what is he trying to communicate to me? So I would love your insight on that, because I don't know. I don't know. I don't always understand. What's the dynamic there? What is he expecting from this interview?
I am neither the 3-year-old whisperer or the dog whisperer, as Glenn knows. So I'm going to leave that alone, JT.
Okay. All right.
I remember one time when our twins were about 3 and my wife walked in a bathroom up the top of the stairs because they were doing something like that and said, "What are you doing?" And one of the girls looked at her and said, "How long were you standing there?" That's when you know you have a problem.
That's right. Well, I have a good one like that. To this day, my daughter, who's now an adult, her best response was hearing her name, and and she would, you'd hear her name, Jessie, and she'd go, "Nothing." And that was it. And it is still a running joke.
Oh man, I love it. I love watching them adopt certain expressions, ways of tilting their head or using their hands. I think that's a big part of that, is this response. "Oh, nothing. How long you been standing in there?" It's amazing to watch them pick up these mannerisms, and also for them to develop their own cadences. So I thought I would bring it relevant to what we were doing here, so that it makes it seem like he wasn't just yelling randomly, which he wasn't.
Yes. That is, you are true to your name, the content interpreter.
Well, I'm going to ask you guys one thing about this real quick, and then it'll probably be our last question. You mentioned, what do you do without social media? And we're talking about being able to relate to people. I was fortunate last month that I went back down to the southern Missouri where I grew up, and was able to hang out with some people I hadn't seen in years, and in an area on boats where there were no phones, there was no technology. So it was interesting going through, I think, different stages of grief and fear when you didn't have that technology around, until it finally was like, this is nice not to have technology around. And then as you're communicating with people you haven't seen in years, you're literally telling stories, finding ways to start relationships all over again. That's no different than talking in front of people who don't know you because you haven't seen them in years. So how do you detach and communicate with people like that, and then take that experience, that knowledge, and turn it into a presentation when you're back talking to people who don't know you because you were telling stories here? Now you're going to tell stories there.
There's another thud on my desk. That's that's an interesting question. I don't know, Paul. I'm going to toss that to you, my friend.
Well, what Glenn is talking about is having a forced experience. I mean, yes, you're there by choice, but the circumstances are forced upon you, and therefore you're using your intuition, you're using your wits, you're using muscles that you might not really be that accustomed to using. And you're also, if I'm hearing you right, in a lot of ways, you're digging deeper. And and again, it comes right back to that recurring phrase here in this episode, which is giving yourself permission. So you can experience it and then forget it, or you can experience it, embrace it, absorb it, and then integrate it into what you're going to do moving forward. And hopefully people treat the information they get here on Blabbit in the same way. Shameless plug.
I think
Shameless plug.
You're allowed. It's on your own show, so you might as well, right? You got the platform. I think that there's that theme, like what you're saying, Paul, of giving yourself permission. Related to that is trusting your own judgment. I think that a lot of times we see, or at least I do, these stories about social media blow-ups or whatever you want to call them, and it's like, ooh, like I certainly don't want to make that mistake.
Right.
And perhaps there's a bit of dialing back. Perhaps and sometimes that's for the best, but I think it also causes some people to retreat a little bit, even in a completely different forum, to maybe not take those experiences like you would have in your situation, Glenn. So it's such a delicate line. And again, I think the other recurring theme for this, at least for me, is that art versus science dichotomy. That is what makes this such fascinating work, and why I continue to love to do it. And I love to see how that applies itself across so many different people in so many different industries at varying levels of success in their career. It's really fascinating to witness. It's the great equalizer, I think, in terms of communication, is that we all have to find our balance in that. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to help do that.
All right. Well, this has been a wonderful episode here, JT. Thank you so much for stopping by at Blabbit. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, the content interpreter, what's the best way to do that?
There's a ton of different ways. So there's my website, contentinterpreter.com. You can also find the content interpreter on LinkedIn. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, and where I will share different insights on each page. And there's often some curation, for example, TED Talks that I think are worth watching or listening to, different insights. You can sign up for my newsletter there. There's a whole bunch of different ways to connect with me. And I would love it if people would take the opportunity and engage, because I love this. It's my life's work, and I love to engage with people and get their thoughts on these interesting topics.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Everyone, we'll be back. You bet. We'll be back on the same bat channel, same bat times next week, everyone. Take care.